The reviews are really nice, aren't they?
People
little browse here now. Informative, accessible and interesting. Fun too. Fun too. Because you're not supposed to be fun otherwise when you're news, but that's
nice.
nice.
We're probably really boring, actually.
Well, one of us is anyway.
It's nice to read them. It's like running a bistro or something like that, isn't it?
It's like TripAdvisor. Yeah. Definitely a result of the knowledge the three hosts have on the topics they're discussing, but also the chemistry between them.
Beautiful. Okay, never been a listener of news podcasts, but I have been converted. Well, thank you very much, Leah Fahy, for that one.
And I have one more for us. I listen to a few news podcasts. What I like about this is the accessibility of it. That's nice. It's not dumbed down, but there also isn't long-winded questions where hosts and guests are trying to sound smart. I also like the tapas style of talking about different news stories.
Tapas.
News tapas. Tapas. News tapas.
Little plate of this, little plate of that.
That's our thing. Right. Let's get plating it up then, buddy.
Hello, you're very welcome along to this latest episode of the Group Chat podcast. I'm news correspondent Zara King and I'm joined by my fellow correspondents Gavan Riley.
Hello.
And Richard Chambers.
Hello.
We're going to start by asking you guys to subscribe.
Yes, please do. Yes.
Leave a comment because we love the comments.
Because we keep meaning to do this because that's kind of like podcast vernacular. Like it's part of the furniture. You're supposed to kind of go like and subscribe or leave us a rating.
It's literally the biggest housekeeping item we have every week and we never do it.
And we keep forgetting to do it. But thank you for everyone who's done it so far and please do keep leaving it because it is actually quite important for trying to keep them up in high rank to make sure that it reaches a bigger audience. So thanks to everyone who's done it and please do keep doing it.
Now, I didn't actually realise it was important to do it though. So, I mean, I'm a listener of podcasts who doesn't realise
listen, this isn't some sort of Elon Musk world where we all know what the algorithm looks like. We just have to do whatever the algorithm says. So apparently it's important though, so please do that.
Okay, well, we're going to get down to it, guys. First of all, we're going to start talking about the rent increase, 9% increase nationally. Average yearly rent for Dublin now higher than the minimum wage.
Yeah.
Not shocking.
No, not shocking, but
terrible, but not shocking,
hardly
unfortunately.
What you would build a society on if like the wage that you could rely on as a full-time worker is literally not enough to even pay for housing, let alone anything else, like, you know, feeding yourself or clothing yourself. Like, it's hardly a surprise, but I think it's the fact that it's now gone up 9% a year and it's kind of reached this magical, but this kind of tipping point where it's a very symbolic thing where, like, you know, you could be working full-time and not even earn enough to pay for the roof over your head. Like, it's a pretty damning statistic.
Especially like the level of increase, like we've been talking about rent and the housing situation in Dublin and around the country for years and years and years. This is the highest growth we've seen in like 5 years.
Yeah.
That's awful. Having a look through the RTB report on this earlier on, one of the things they mentioned as well is that there's a lack of new tenancies coming on stream as well. So clearly people are either staying on longer in situations which might be somewhat precarious, or they're locked in at high rents, or there's a shortage of supply as well for new rental properties. None of which is good news if we were looking for this trend to turn around.
Of course, you can understand why people wouldn't be leaving on a whim either, because previously, if you might have thought, oh, I don't like this place, or like the household is kind of breaking up and I want to move on, that you sort of feel like you had a little more comfort to do it. But now when there is just nowhere available and they're all so expensive, of course you're more likely to just stay put where you are and stay put with the housemates that you had, unless you've had like a bigger change in your circumstances, you know.
Double as well what it was 10 years ago. It's another fact of of where we're at. Basically, if you're looking at the Dublin thing as being like €2,000 per month, that's
it's a frightening amount of money.
It is awful. But it's interesting because they put this out on Twitter earlier on. They put it on Instagram as well. And I was kind of surprised at the amount of comments which are just like, go live with your parents or just leave Dublin. As if, and this was actually based around the fact around minimum wage for the year. If you're working full-time minimum wage at $10.50 an hour, that you couldn't possibly afford average rent in Dublin, because even with all of your money. But it was interesting that people were like, but that's only the minimum wage people. And it's like, well, okay, you're living in the capital city, where most of the, you know,
the
retail jobs, all the service jobs in the country, a lot of them based around Dublin. A lot of those are a minimum wage, and we're just basically saying to people who are working a minimum wage then, all right, just go live somewhere else and commute in. Is that the message?
The person who sells you a bottle of water in Centra who's working full-time on a minimum wage.
And commuting is so expensive.
Exactly. And that's only getting more expensive. But just the point I want to make, because I just find the thing and the incessant pushing by some people around, just go live with your parents for a couple of years until it's grand. Well, there's a huge level of presumption around that.
Yeah, there is.
And I just find that it's a little bit uncaring.
Oh, like Threshold, the National Housing Charity, issued a statement on this today as well. Just wanted to point to one of the things that they said is that this report hides some of the incredibly worrying increases on a county and city level, particularly those subject to rent pressure zones and a 2% cap on rent increase. And they go on to say that this is money that many people do not have to spare, given the spike in inflation and huge increases in the cost of energy and fuel. Exactly what we were saying there in terms of that idea of people being forced to commute.
But it hides the increases. A report that found that the average rate has gone up 9% is still hiding some of the increases.
Yeah, concerning.
It's frightening.
It is frightening. I just want to take you through some of the comments that we got in just via Instagram, as Richard mentioned there earlier. One lady says 2,150 a month for a one-bed apartment in Varadkar in Dublin 6. We also have to pay €50 to park our car in the apartment car park. Over $2,000 a month for a one-bed apartment in Dublin.
But the thing about this is that you'll also get other people in the comments who are like, yeah, but like, just move on and try and buy somewhere.
Don't need to.
How are you meant to buy somewhere if you're spending $2,000 a month?
Yeah.
On
How are you ever supposed to pull together the deposit or have any kind of?
But also, like the banks will say, oh well, we're not seeing any capacity here to save, even though your mortgage might be less than the €2,000 or whatever. It's just like it feels like a trap for so many people of our generation and beneath as well, and it's just. Yeah, it's incessant.
Even if you go outside of Dublin, actually, just want to read another comment here. Athlone, one-bed apartment, €800 a month. Very lucky to be paying so little, to be honest, says this person. I mean, €800 is still a lot of money. You'd want to be earning like decent money to be paying €800 a month as well. I mean, that's not accessible to everybody.
You're not necessarily going to have the same standard of, you know, maybe urban high-tech salary that you might keep you going in the same way as you would in Dublin that you might be able to get by. That €800 in Athlone, given the relative income you're going to have for jobs around that area, isn't really going to be all that affordable.
Another person here says, not me, but a friend of mine is paying $1,800 a month for a one-bed apartment near Houston Station in Dublin. She says, my mortgage is half of that for a two-bed terraced house in Dundrum. There's just so many examples here. Another person...
Sorry, Dundrum, Dublin or Dundrum, Tipperary?
Dublin.
Because even like a mortgage of $900 a month in Dundrum is great.
Yeah, it's
Can I have that, please? That's great going.
That's like you're the pressure a little bit.
My wife and I are now in our house. We were very lucky enough to be able to just about get our feet in the ladder before this current rise of the last 5 or 6 years really took off. So we were got in at thankfully a useful enough time. And the house a couple of doors down went up for rent at around the same time as we bought. And when we bought, our mortgage was about 100 more than the rent was. And since then, because interest rates just came down, our mortgage has gone down a little bit, and rent, of course, has only gone one way. Where now a house identical to ours in our estate is literally $1,000 more per month than the mortgage. Like, which is just, it's so wrong.
No, it's
so I needed just another couple like myself and Ciara, just who happened to meet a couple of years later, or just didn't have the resources to be able to get on the ladder when they did, and are hit to the tune of 10 grand a year more because they just weren't lucky enough to get in there at the right time. It's awful.
No, it's outrageous.
So awful.
Just to go back outside of Dublin again, because I feel like whenever we have this conversation, we're always talking about Dublin, and I actually think it's really interesting to hear the feedback from people outside of Dublin. So, €980 for a 4-bed house in Carlow, cheap for Carlow, but house in terrible condition, mould, leaks, etc. So that speaks to the point that you were making about people will stay on perhaps longer in places that aren't suitable because it's.
You have to take the risk. You have a risk of whether or not you're going to find somewhere which is in your price bracket, or whether or not you'll be able to have a lease which is in any way secure. So, like, I mean, that is a thing. You can be caught in a situation which is far from ideal, could be below minimum acceptable standards even.
€1,100 in Carlow, 3-bed house. Now, we paid same cost in Dublin last year to share a house with 3 other people. So,
wow.
Yeah, again, I suppose that speaks to this idea of moving out.
Maybe where the new era of remote working will work for people. If you only have to be in the car 1 or 2 days a week, that it's possible to live there and then have a much more comfortable standard of living. But then, of course, there's still the 2 days a week where you're going to be sitting on the M9 for an hour and a half up and down. So it doesn't work for everyone. No,
just last one there, just outside of Dublin. Cork luxury 1-bed apartment for €1,450 a month. Moving to Mayo in 2 months, and we'll be renting a 2-bed for $1,000. So there's value for money in some places, but it really depends, and you can get really lucky.
But if your circumstances or your industry enables you to work in those areas where there's better value housing, but if you don't, like our line of work, you can't do it from rural Ireland.
If you can't remote work and the industry that you're looking to work in isn't in any of those counties where it's less than €1,000 a month.
Yeah. Well, to live on your own now, it seems that you really have to be able to spend €1,000 a month minimum to be able to afford to live completely by yourself. So it's certainly something that is not. I mean,
it's just a huge, because then that's at the very minimum. €12,000 a year, which means that before, that's after you've been taxed and paid whatever else as well, which means that just to cover your rent alone, your earnings have to be over 20,000 a year purely to take care of putting the roof over your head. And then anything more you earn after that then is what gets taxed, and you can pay for your food and clothing and fuel and everything else. It's such an enormous chunk of everyone's resources. It's just wild.
It's just so easy to see why people are just getting so despondent about this, and people have been crying out about this for years and years now, that I just don't know. I mean, even people of our generation, as I say again, and below, how do they look at this situation? And you hear in the Dáil time after time, you hear, we're getting on, we're building new things and all that sort of stuff. And it seems to be just this circular argument that you hear in the Dáil around it, while every single day people are scrimping and saving to try and get through this. And I just don't think it answers anything about, it doesn't say anything about the situation, the social impact of actually what's happening, and the lives that are put on hold, whether that's couples or people on their own, or people with small kids who are in precarious rental situations who are just asked to go along with this because there is no way out of it that we've found over the last 5-6 years of this.
But even it's this concept of the bank of mum and dad, and that everyone is expected to rely on their parents to support them through it. Not everyone has the opportunity to do that. But not even just financially, say people are being asked to get their deposits from their parents, they're also being told to move back home in with their parents. That's a huge pressure on couples who maybe, are heading for retirement, want to enjoy their time by themselves.
Just presuming that everybody has the perfect ideal family at home,
and
that people's, personal relationships and dynamics in their own families are exactly the same. That we all have the same exact monolith of a family.
It's all on the presumption as well that the bank of mum and dad have already cleared off their mortgage, which if you bought in the 1990s isn't necessarily guaranteed either.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really difficult situation. I think it's disgraceful in so many ways that there's people of our age that are still struggling. And I think whatever about, if you're doing it with someone else, trying to do it by yourself, it's just not geared towards single people either. I think it's something that is for another day's discussion, but it's definitely very difficult if people are trying to do it by themselves.
One final word on that, actually, just because you mentioned the difficulties for young people, and that's absolutely true. What we don't talk about enough in the media is the challenges for people who actually meet a bit later in life, or have gone through relationships and those relationships have ended, and then they find themselves newly single again, and then they might only meet their partner when they're approaching 40 or even into their 40s. They often find it impossible to get a mortgage even if they have the money, because they're told that, well, you really want to have your mortgage paid off by the time you've retired, and if you come knocking on the bank when you're 45, they're going to tell you, well, you're going to be retired at 67 or 68, so we need you to be able to afford a 20-year mortgage. And a 20-year mortgage, no matter how much, if you're borrowing over 30 or 35 years, might be manageable. Paying over 20 years is the crucial point of difference, which will make it unaffordable for a lot of people. So if you meet somebody in your early 40s, or that's just the way your life has worked out, or you've had a relationship breakdown, mortgages then are almost out of reach because you don't have enough of a working life left. How depressing is that?
I know, God.
Very.
We have to. We will definitely be revisiting this topic again, because it's just something that unfortunately is not going away. We're going to move on. This investigation into Leo Varadkar, Gavan, is continuing. What is the latest on that? What exactly is happening?
Well, actually, we're recording this on Wednesday night, and Leo Varadkar has just spoken publicly for the first time about all of this, and says that he still maintains his innocence, that what is being alleged as a criminal charge is not something that he did. We should probably explain to people actually what is being investigated, because maybe the nature of the alleged crime here has maybe gone over people's heads or hasn't been dealt with enough in the last week. Nobody denies that Leo Varadkar shared a document which was marked as confidential, a deal struck between the government and the IMO with a rival organisation, the NAGP. Leo Varadkar says that he did this because he wanted the NAGP to share the details of this contract so that they would canvass in its favour, because GPs needed to ballot to accept it. What is alleged, of course, is that, and this is somewhat borne out by the text messages which were obtained and published by Village magazine, is that the NAGP did not intend for this to be them campaigning in favour of the deal. They were a rival of the IMO, and they wanted to use this to undercut or to somehow undermine the negotiating efforts of a rival group. The issue is proving in black and white that Leo Varadkar shared the contract knowing that this was the gain or the intention of the NAGP. Because what is being investigated is an alleged corruption offence. What does corruption mean? Basically, it means that you acted knowing that you were giving someone inappropriate gain. You were conferring a gain on somebody. And Leo Varadkar's argument is, well, I didn't do it for the gain of the NAGP. I did it because I wanted this deal to be successfully accepted by GPs. And that's his argument. What is interesting about all this politically, of course, is that Leo Varadkar is supposed to become Taoiseach again in about 7.5 months. And if all of this still hasn't been cleaned up at the time, then it becomes an issue. And people will probably wonder, why is it an issue if he's going to become Taoiseach? He's already tarnished it. Shouldn't it be an issue now? And of course, it is an issue. It's become an issue. It was raised in the Dáil. It was a motion of no confidence in him. It is an issue. But in December, when he's supposed to become Taoiseach again, there has to be another vote. Micheál Martin has to resign as Taoiseach on December the 15th, and the Dáil has to therefore elect a new one. And if it's going to be Leo Varadkar, there's going to be a lot of people within the government parties, particularly even within Fine Gael, who are going to have serious issues about electing someone as Taoiseach who still has an alleged corruption offence hanging over them from the last time that they were Taoiseach. And that's where the sensitivity is, and whether, a man is entitled to the presumption of innocence, and that's Micheál Martin's line. You are completely entitled to be presumed innocent until a court says otherwise. But in high office, there is a higher standard than that. You can't merely be innocent. You have to be seen to be above reproach. And if there is the suggestion that Leo Varadkar may be facing charges, or worse still, if a prosecution has been initiated, the idea that you would allow someone become Taoiseach who is still literally about to face trial for corruption in the office of Taoiseach is a total no-go. So it may be a very difficult thing to prosecute, and of course we don't know when the DPP might issue a direction as to whether it should go to court or not, but you can understand politically why it's a really sensitive thing, and why 18 months after all of this broke, the fact that it hasn't yet been put completely to bed is a worry for those in government. And
that's the point though, Richard, isn't it? Because like a lot of people, you were saying, you had messages from some people saying, oh, this is old news, why don't we move on? But it's not old news, and it does matter.
Of course it does matter. It's literally about who runs the country and whether or not they're being investigated
the motivation
in committing a criminal offence.
Yeah.
I find like it is worth saying, like, for people who do have that point of view and they're like, well, why does this matter? It doesn't really matter. We have more important things to talk about. Would they feel that way if it was another political party that they didn't like that this was about? I'm not sure. But I find it very interesting, Gavan, actually, how this was all handled over the weekend in terms of what was the information that was pushed out to media organisations.
It was confirmed by the Garda Press Office on Saturday afternoon that the file had been handed over. So the Guards have to pull together a file. They've been investigating it for literally 17 months. And on Saturday afternoon, they confirmed, two members of the media, I think the Irish Independent was the first outlet to have it. They confirmed, right, the file has been concluded now, it's handed over, it's gone to the DPP. The Guards have made no recommendation, which, by the way, may be significant as well, because often the Guards would recommend a prosecution. This time around, the Guards have handed over the file and have made no recommendation. They've left it entirely up to the DPP to decide. But then on Saturday evening, we saw the front page of the Sunday Independent, and it was pointing out from some well-informed sources, presumably, that there actually was very little prospect of this being finished by December, because the file, if it took 18 months to put together, the DPP might take some time to decide whether there should be a prosecution or whether one is warranted. And that, of course, is politically sensitive because, as we said, in 7.5 months' time, the guy's supposed to be taking over the country again. And can you do that if this isn't mopped up? So we did have the Fine Gael press officer and people in the Leo Varadkar camp pointing people towards the last annual report of the DPP, which says that's probably not going to happen because 92% of cases are directed within 6 months. So there isn't. They said, "Oh, sure, it's not going to happen. We're not going to have the DPP still sitting on this, wondering what's going to happen in December." Because, sure, no, most cases are dealt with early, and of course they're entitled to draw attention to that and to say that, in fact, all this will be on.
Would as well.
But it's interesting that they would. But yes, okay, the average case does get directed within 4 or 8 or 12 weeks, but the average case doesn't involve a then Taoiseach being accused of corruption in the country's highest political office. So it might well take longer, and there is now apparently a practice of the DPP going back to the Guards with follow-on questions or bringing in private senior counsel to help them decide whether a prosecution is warranted or whether charges might stick, given the evidence that are there. So, like, it is a very, very sensitive thing. And, you know, Fine Gael sources are quite calm about it all. They're confident that when the DPP does issue a direction, it will be no prosecution here, clean bill of health, everything's fine. But I wouldn't be confident until you actually get it in writing, you know?
Yeah, but this is the next question. I know you're saying, you know, internally in the party, are there certain people, or are there some people who are perhaps looking at this as an opportunity to break through and maybe, you know, reach their leadership ambitions? I mean, is this something that's happening behind the scenes?
No doubt there are. And one thing which is fascinating about the dynamic of all of this is that whenever you have a heave, no one wants to be seen to be the person who launched the heave, because if you are the person who wielded the dagger, like what's the old days, a Shakespearean line, he who wields the dagger never wears the crown.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you are the person who takes out, if you knife the leader, then you're already damaged goods. You can't be doing that. If you have a situation where a leader is toppled and nobody knifed them, then it's kind of fair game for everyone, because you don't have ambitious people who are sort of sitting around going, God, I'd love Leo Varadkar's job, but I can't be seen to be pushing him over.
And there are a few people who certainly would.
Well, but if the DPP then does the job for them, then they sort of might feel like they're entitled to be a little bit more aggressive in the push. Do bear in mind as well, if Leo Varadkar does face prosecution, there is no way in hell he can remain in government. In fact, he probably can't remain as a Fine Gael leader. Doubtfully whether he could even remain on as a TD if he was still facing charges, even with the presumption of innocence, because of the standards of high office. The last Fine Gael leadership contest took about 2 months. So if you want to have a new Fine Gael leader in place by December the 15th to take over as Taoiseach, you need to have the job vacated by like the middle of December. You basically announce the budget and then tell Leo he's got to go. So like, if it's contested, it takes a long time to fill the vacancy. So
well, to be clear, it's not happening at the moment, but let's just, play fantasy Fine Gael leader game. Like, who are the names?
I mean,
will Simon Coveney be, back in the
Simon
sort of
Coveney was the preferred candidate among the grassroots last time in this hypothetical leadership election that is not yet happening.
They still hold a candle to Simon Coveney.
They do. Simon Coveney is very well loved by the
Leo
grassroots.
Varadkar obviously won the last leadership election, but that's because the votes were weighted in favour of the parliamentary party. Simon Coveney was by far the more popular candidate among grassroots members, and even among local authority members. It was genuinely only TDs and senators that pulled Leo over the line. So Simon Coveney would be there. You have to bear in mind, though, too, that if you're electing a new leader now, you are looking at the next general election when Fine Gael will already have been in power for 3 terms in a row. So if you choose Simon Coveney as your leader, yes, he might be a very valuable and capable leader, but when it comes to the next general election, will he be the guy that gets you a 4th term? Or do you even expect to get another term? Do you say we need a leader for opposition? And like the 6 ministers that have gone in cabinet right now, Leo Varadkar's been in cabinet since day one of this administration, since like February 2011. Leo Varadkar has been there. It's 11 years unbroken in cabinet. Simon Coveney, exactly the same. Pascal Donoghue has been in cabinet since 2014. By the next election, he could be there for 11 years, as has Heather Humphreys. Simon Harris has been in cabinet since 2016, so he's already been there for 6 years. The new blood is Helen McEntee, and then at the junior ministerial ranks, the likes of Josefa Madigan or a Brendan Griffin or a Hildegard Naughton, they're the newer TDs. So it would actually be a big question as to whether they elect someone thinking that's going to be the Taoiseach and our next Taoiseach, are looking for another term, or are they already thinking about the generation of rebuilding? Because
let's just talk names.
Yeah,
who are they talking about? They're talking about Helen McEntee. They're talking about Simon Harris.
Simon Harris has been vocal in the past about his desire and his wish.
But
to
Simon Harris supported Simon Coveney the last time out ferociously. So if you were to have a battle of the Simons.
But it won't be. I don't think it will be, because I actually
think it will come to that.
Well, see, they may have to have a consensus candidate because they can't afford to spend 2 months choosing a leader.
Go on, tell us. I feel like you've got a
people in Fine Gael say they don't see Simon Harris as much anymore.
Right.
In the media. And this is what they notice. This is what people in Fine Gael talk about.
He's in a
who's out there? Who do you see?
profile brief.
Yeah, well, and they say that they see Helen McEntee a lot.
But some people would have argued that he was overexposed prior to that. So, I mean, it was a different time, obviously.
Some would argue that his overexposure in the last job was what ultimately brought the government down, because bear in mind, the last election was called because there was going to be a motion of no confidence in Simon Harris, and then lo and behold, a pandemic comes along and his reputation is completely healed. But if it had to be done at short notice because you needed to have a new leader in place by December, you probably couldn't afford to have a contest. So then would it become Coveney by acclamation because he's the deputy leader in a safe pair of hands?
I need to hear your thoughts on this. I feel like you've got this space.
It could be. I mean, those are the 2 names that people in Fine Gael talk about. It's Helen McEntee and it's Simon Coveney.
Yeah.
Simon Harris isn't mentioned as much as he would have been maybe a year ago. Those are the 2 names. And people who, are deep in Fine Gael, they think that Helen McEntee, they've identified her from a long way out as being somebody they think will be a long-term hope for the party. But
the only thing
whether or not it actually ends up, people do this all the time.
You have to try and choose a leader who is both a capable politician but also has this sense of personality that people can get behind. And there was an argument, yes, that Simon Harris was overexposed. In a way, you can almost argue that Helen McEntee as a personality is underexposed, because you see a lot about what she's doing in her day job, but do you know very much about her as a personality beyond her family history, taking maternity leave and the circumstances of her father's passing and how she came into the Dáil in the first place? Don't know much about her in terms of what gets her up, what she spend her weekends doing, what TV does she like. Like, you don't get much of that on the old Instagram.
They'd start wheeling out a couple of feature pieces, you know what I mean? There'll be profiles done. That's how this works, you know?
It is, but the thing is that it is being talked about. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
the fact of the matter is that it is being
talked about amongst people outside of the bubble. Like, we talk about the bubble, we talk about, journalists and politicians, my civilian friends who don't work in media, like, that aren't,
well, it's
they're
like,
they would say, oh, is Helen McEntee going to be the next leader of Fine Gael? Like, it comes up in conversations at the brunch table.
It's
you know
talked
what I
about
mean?
in ways that people don't talk about a Fianna Fáil leadership anymore.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's actually a really good point. Yeah.
Because it was a time when it was like, oh, is it going to be Barry Count? Is it going to be Dara Calleary? Is it going to be Jim O'Callaghan? That's all just evaporated away now.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, we can only look at one leadership vacancy at a time, and we've just kind of vented our angst with the Labour heave about a month ago, so maybe they all feel like they've got it out of their hair now.
Well, anyway, look, it's not happening at the moment, but
but it's definitely something to watch, because even if the chances are that a prosecution would be too precarious to bring, and even if there ends up being no charge, how long will it take for that decision to come? Because there's a serious banana skin if it doesn't get done in the next 6 months.
Absolutely. Okay, last week we spoke about Twitter, we spoke about Elon Musk, and I think none of us really thought last week this was going to happen as fast as it did.
Not as quickly.
No, we didn't. I think we were like, oh, there's a couple of weeks in this. But there is a Twitter takeover happening now. I suppose, is it going to change free speech, Richard? Is there a risk in all of this? I mean, I don't know. Were you surprised at the day when it actually happens so quickly?
Probably am, in terms of the speed of its happening.
Yeah.
But not surprised that money talks.
I know, of course not. Yeah.
Like,
what was it? Your tweet at world's richest man gets what he wants, and that's what happened. Some interesting things about. I was reading a piece today on Reuters, and they were just weighing up as like, oh my God, this happened very easily in the end. Or, well, it isn't a done deal yet. But the fact that now Elon Musk is sitting there having committed to spend $44 billion on this thing, which he will soon discover is a lot harder to run than it is to buy, that he might want to nuke the deal and pull out. And there's one thing which is in the agreement between him and Twitter, which is that he doesn't go after Twitter employees. And if you read his tweets over the last couple of days, you could imply that some of what he said has been quite critical of senior Twitter. So it's part of the deal that he's not allowed to, like, single out staff members.
As part of the merger agreement, which is published by the New York Times today, he can't disparage Twitter or any of its employees. Disparage, apparently, according to lawyers, is in the eye of the beholder.
Okay.
It's only going to play out, it's only going to come into fact is if it actually went up to court. But he has certainly, as an outsider, non-legal thing, he has talked crap about people involved in Twitter.
Freedom of speech.
That's the official.
That's the hat you wear for it.
Yeah.
But it's just an interesting thing, is if you signed up to a deal which says don't do this.
Yeah.
And to some degree you are doing that.
Yeah.
Some people are like, well what's going on?
Because it all does feel like, look, I mean, the guy knows his business better than I do or anyone else does, but it does feel like a serious impulse buy. That it's only a couple of weeks since he started talking, he built up his 9% stake, and he was like, will I join the board? And then he agreed not to join the board, partly because as a member of the board, you couldn't disparage the company either.
An impulse buy is walking past the vending machine out in the corridor and getting a Snickers on the way into the podcast. Like,
when
you know
you're
what I
a
mean?
billionaire, Twitter's an impulse buy. You know what I mean? Like, it is what it is.
It's extraordinary.
But relative.
We were talking last week about how he's we could describe him as a free speech absolutist, and that was going to be the danger of the platform. He has kind of interestingly tried to walk that back a little bit, or at least to refine our understanding of that in the last couple of days, because now he's saying, well, by freedom of speech, I mean whatever your country allows. If your country doesn't allow hate speech, or doesn't allow you to, as some countries do, if it doesn't allow you to deny the existence of the Holocaust, Twitter's not going to let you do it. So he's suddenly now not saying that it's going to be this sort of legal bandit country free-for-all. He's only going to allow you to say whatever is legal, which at least is a refinement. But it doesn't deal.
He did say that in that TEDx thing, though. Back 2 or 3 weeks ago, he did say that like Twitter would follow under his leadership. That Twitter would follow the rules of the country it operated in.
Which at least means that he's not a total absolutist. Yeah. But it does still mean that content which is not currently allowed on Twitter, certain types of harassment or negative commentary or disinformation, stuff which is, Mark Little used the phrase the other day, lawful but awful, will now be allowed, it would seem, under his watch. So, for example, some Russian media outlets or governmental accounts denying the facts of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine is not unlawful. Like, you're allowed to lie. But Twitter right now says, can't do that. That's bad faith. You can't do that. And it would seem now that's going to be permissible. And it's just one example of things of how the law does allow you to say things, but it doesn't mean that you're a very nice person for doing it.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't mind saying I took a massive step back from Twitter. Like, both of you know that. Like, I came off Twitter. Like, I didn't come off Twitter completely. Like, I have to do a certain amount of Twitter for work, but like, you know, I went through a terrible time on Twitter before Christmas, like, and I reported all of those tweets and nothing was ever done about it. Yeah. And Twitter is not a safe place for people that, you know, if you report something and it doesn't get dealt with, you don't want to be there anymore. Like, I did not want to be there really anymore, to be honest. I'm doing as much as I have to do for work.
But that's an example of commentary. Like, it's actually debatable whether it was lawful, but if it does fall on the side of it being lawful, it is evidently, it's awful. But if it is lawful, then Twitter right now is hardly, you know, it's hardly a wonderful place to be. But if that is now going to be completely fair game, where the terms of service aren't even that, oh, you can't say mean things about someone, then
but how do you make it, what do you make of that then, Zara? Like, I mean, this idea, like, you have everybody, and I can understand where people are coming from when they say this, that, like, they're concerned about what will happen in terms of hate speech and in terms of, you know, racism and misinformation, disinformation on Twitter. To me, and probably to you as well, I'd say this sounds like stuff that's already on Twitter.
It's already there. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, sometimes I hear this conversation with the worries about Elon Musk, and I'm like, Twitter wasn't really like a very pleasant place anyway. I don't know how it's that different.
Well, it's known as a hell site for a reason.
Yeah, like, but I never had that experience before. Like, it was new for me, kind of, like, not new for me, but I think that I just, like, you and I had spoken, like, we've all spoken about this, and I think I kind of, in terms of how you handle things on Twitter, like, sometimes you would mute people that would say really vicious, nasty stuff, and then it just you'd mute them and you might report it, and then nothing was being done about it. And it just gets to a point then where you're like, every day you're blocking a bunch of people who are just assholes, like, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a very hard
and
sell.
Like, I don't mind anybody being, I think that, like, you have to be able to come in and be, you know, have your viewpoint and be critical, but when it becomes personal, that's actually not okay.
It definitely reached a new level, didn't it, like, not long into the pandemic, because suddenly, like, people who may have been somewhat passive up to that point were suddenly, like, in all of our mentions, and all of our colleagues as well, and you were either a government patsy because you weren't challenging enough what was being said, or you were undermining.
I didn't even mind that so much. Like, that wasn't the worst of it.
Undermining the national response by being in any way sort of sceptical or even looking for scrutiny on these things. And a lot of people found it very difficult to get the sweet spot. But if that's at the start of it, then 18 or 24 months in, and people still think you're being a government patsy, or that you're not being...
But that's not the main thing.
Issue, really. I don't want to get into it, to be honest, because I don't really want to give it any oxygen. Like, but I would just say that, you know, all of us have experienced a certain level of trolling, but I would say, and, you know, the nature of the trolling that I got was different to the nature of the trolling that men got.
Totally
and I think, you know, other female colleagues of ours, journalists who've been on Twitter, have had similar experiences. And I think it's unfortunate, really, that, you know, and I wish I didn't kind of feel like that, actually. I wish that I, you know, didn't let it upset me, but it did upset me in the end, and I did feel like it pushed me back off Twitter a little bit, and I'm not really using Twitter. Like, if I look at my screen time, I'm probably on Twitter for about 10 minutes a week now, which is terrible, like, because this is the job and I should be on it, but I'm not, because it's not a...
Well, the one thing that is maybe somewhat optimistic, or a little sunnier outlook about Elon Musk's sort of manifesto for the site as well, is that although he might be a bit more permissive about what you're allowed to say, he also says that you're basically going to be required to at least not publicly disclose your identity. Not every account is going to have the equivalent of a blue tick where they know exactly who you are, but the site at least needs to know who you are. The idea would be that you would not be allowed to use the site unless you have already verified your own identity with it.
No.
I don't buy it, because you'd be kicking off so many users, but at least if the manifesto is that, like, at least the site will know who is abusing you, and therefore potentially make it easier for you to take action if that's necessary. Might be something more optimistic, but
Look to this, man, that's not going to happen. This is not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that the EU is already revving up and saying, over our dead body, are you going to, you know, push on with all of this, you know, making this the absolute... Like, he keeps on going on about this being the town square of the internet is Twitter.
Oh, yeah, he said that, yeah. Or this idea that people don't use telephones,
all I can do
they
is
use Twitter. Like, as if people don't use telephones, they use Twitter. It's like, no.
It'll be interesting to see how it all comes out. I would say to people, don't think that this is as much of a done deal as it appears to be.
And don't think that it's probably really going to change it that much either, when it's pretty...
Well, look, the guy, he's a businessman who's just sunk $46 billion into a product. He doesn't want to kill the product. He needs it to try and stay like some sort of financially stable thing. He's not going to spend 50 billion on a
One
pet
thing that he
project.
did say he was going to introduce just before we should move on, but just the edit button, this idea that you'd be able to edit your tweets.
Yeah. Well,
But then there would be a thread though of what you would originally put up and then the new
that's the important bit, because the reason why they've never done it before now is that you could post a tweet with a typo and you might edit the typo or insert a letter that you'd forgotten, and that'd be fine. But you could also post the tweet, have people see it in its original format, and then edit it to say completely the opposite 5 seconds later. And that's the thing, because if you allowed somebody to be maliciously mistaken, where if like you ran a breaking news account and you tweeted something and 5 seconds later you could tweet the contents to say something entirely different, then it's a material skewing of the timeline. So if there was like a trace of what you'd originally said, it does kind of maybe undermine the point of having an edit button in the first place, but it would be nice to be able to change a typo on something once in a while.